On behalf of the National Film Board, welcome to this special Q&A/discussion related to the documentary short, Now is the Time. With me today in our virtual studio, a community elder and Haida scholar, Barbara Wilson, and director Christopher Auchter. Christopher is in Burnaby, British Columbia, and Barbara is in Haida Gwaii, also in British Columbia. I'm in Vancouver. Welcome, both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Selma. Good to be here.
I think the last time we were all together was for the community screening of the film in Haida Gwaii last November. As I recall, the hall was filled to capacity, and there's this sense of anticipation all around. Barbara, I wonder if you can tell me something about your experience that evening.
Well, my heart was just full. I was so proud of the fact that Chris was able to take, of course, with your help, take the old footage and put it together in a way that was so respectful of Robert Davidson, his grandfather, grandmother, Florence and Robert Davidson, and the village of Old Masset. I was nervous, but at the same time, I was just elated when I walked in the hall and saw how many people were inside. It was amazing.
Thank you. And Chris, what was it for you? I mean, I was dealing with you on this project, and certain times I could feel, a certain amount of, the anticipation. How did it feel for you on that evening to have the film being launched in Haida Gwaii?
Yeah, well, I was incredibly nervous bringing the film home, especially Masset, where the pole went up and this whole story took place, this resurgence. Yeah, so I was nervous, and I had hoped when I was creating this film, there was a part of me that had hoped that this film could help be a way of springboarding further stories that happened that day, because 16 minutes, you can't include everything. And man, after the credits rolled and the lights came back up, people just they stood up and they started clapping, and it was such an organic thing. And then I went to the front of the room and said just a few brief words, and then the stories from the people that were there just came out, and the sharing of further stories about what it was like to be there, what it meant to them. Some were funny stories, some were heartfelt. Well, they're all heartfelt, but yeah, it was incredible, and I don't know if I'd experienced something like that again. So I'm just so I don't know what the word is. Well, I know the word, but it's not coming to my head right now. But
Magical, maybe.
Yeah, magical. It was magical. Yeah.
So what I would like to go back now, here we have a film, the screening is taking place 50 years after the actual event. And one person who was witness to both of those was Barbara. So Barbara, can you tell us how you really came to be involved with this project? And when I say the project, not the making of the first film, but the idea of the poll. It's the making of the first film, the first NFB film. Barbara, can you elaborate on that?
Sure.
Much as you can.
I was selected as one of, I think there were 7 of us, young people at the time, First Nations from across Canada. And we were selected to learn about cinematography in all aspects. And I had spent at that point almost, a year and a half with the National Film Board in Montreal. And there were several people that I was involved by learning from them, and one was Dennis Gilson, George Stoney, Norm McLaren, and we learned about animation, lighting of stages, cinematography, operating cameras, editing, script writing. And in script writing, one of the ladies that worked there had written a script about the fact that all the regalia was behind glass in several museums. And it looked like a real good thing to do. And so I took the script with the permission of my bosses and went to Ottawa and raised money to do the actual script that Peggy had done. And I got $20,000, which was a lot of money 50 years ago. And then I went back to National Film Board and they gave me another 10. And then Peggy and I had a falling out. I was young and inexperienced and not very aware of a lot of things. And so then we had this $30,000 and wanted to do something. And it turned out Robert was putting this pole up. And I can't remember if I knew about it previous to everything else that was going on, but we flew out from Montreal. And I imagine we got permission from Robert's family to do the filming. Otherwise, it wouldn't have happened. And then we were there before the pole raising. We were there after the pole raising for a few days. And then we brought all the shot material back to Montreal. And the cutting, the editing and everything happened through someone else. I wasn't involved in that part. By then, I had moved back to the West Coast and had come home to Haida Gwaii. And so about 3 years ago, I was talking to one of the executive directors and I got to look at the film for the first time. And I was unhappy with the content. And so we had a ensuing discussion about the outs and all the different parts of that story that was captured on film. And because it was going to be Robert's 50th anniversary for the first pole that was put up, I spoke with his brother, Reg, and we said, wouldn't it be great if we could do something with the old footage? And we didn't even know if it existed yet. And so we talked to the person, and I'm sorry, I can't remember what her name was.
Michelle.
But yeah, but we ended up talking about it, and Chris was brought in and you all were brought in, and this film is the end product. And I'm so grateful for the changes for the recreation that you did in putting this together, that showed a more realistic story and showed the emotion of those days leading up to it and that time, because I felt that the whole crew did the family and the Haida Nation proud.
Okay, so at this point, I'd like to turn to Chris. Chris, can you talk? So you are brought in now to look at this footage, and you have this challenge to actually, quote unquote, get it right. What sort of motivated you, to the point that you felt compelled to want to tell this story?
Yeah, well, I mean, it was a surprise what to be tapped on the shoulder and say, "Hey, Chris, can you create a new film with this footage? Here's the old film. Here's the B-roll. Do you think it's something you could do?" The one I was surprised because I came from an animation background doing animated films. Just finished them out in Ascona, and I was actually in the NFB office with the hopes of creating a new one. and Shirley Veercruz mentioned that Barbara and Michelle were talking, and they would like a new film done based on this old film and the old footage. So that was the first shock. And the second shock was the more I dug into this film and the story, the more I realized I was like, this is such an important story. Why did I not know this story growing up, having grown up on Haida Gwaii and spending all my summers in Masset from my teenage years, commercial fishing with my grandfather. And that's where my grandma Babs and my grandpa Bruce lived. So we spent a lot of time there. Why didn't I know about this? Robert's pole was always there, the bear with the bear mother story on it. So yeah, the more I dove in, the more I got excited, and the more I was just like, this is such an important story. And yeah, I really had to learn it to be able to share it, and not just surface learn it, like try to learn it as deeply as I could, try to figure out what was going on in that time period. Yeah, that would have created this big era of our art kind of not being displayed or totem poles in our streets. And as it was said in Robert's book, The 4 Decades, you know, where once there were totem poles, there now stood telephone poles. So why was that? There was a big question for me. So a lot of questions for me to try to answer, and why it was so important that I came across the Inbridge Orchard interviews with like Joe Weir, with the elder Joe Weir, and he gave those firsthand accounts that really drove it home into me, kind of what happened, and just kind of the degree of that it did happen, like chopping them into 4-foot blocks. There's just so much power in all those words, and this action that was taken to carve the first totem pole in nearly a century, and resurging our culture, because the potlatch is attached to the pole raising. You have to have a potlatch, and with the potlatch comes the songs and the dances and the weaving. And you could see people were just making it happen with whatever they could. There were no masks, there were no headdresses left. Well, make it out of paper, out of cardboard. And they're so proud to display those signs of our culture again. It was so powerful.
Yeah, I realize, Chris, that when you're doing the research, from my perspective as a producer, you're almost obsessed with getting the material as authentic as possible. And you'd go to BC archives and listen to all of the tapes that were done 30 and 40 years ago, in some cases longer. You'd look at all of the footage. Was there a turning point from you where you felt that, as Barbara said, you had this yoke on your shoulder to get it right and to acknowledge the work that was done by the previous generations?
Yeah, and that the sense of trying to get information from the source, so it wasn't secondhand, which is why the Joe Weir story was so important to me. And also the first line in the film, like how it starts off, like one of the stories, just in terms to try to display the situation and give context that this is the first totem pole. This was an unusual occurrence and one to be celebrated, because totem poles come up more often nowadays. So I didn't know if the audience would think, oh, it's a totem pole raising, very beautiful, very nice, but the fact that this hadn't happened in so long. So I needed to try to provide the context. And through talking with Robert, one of his stories that he told me was, there was this time that he was referred to as he could be the last Haida carver. And I was like, what? All these things were just like so new to me. I didn't realize, I knew we had gone through the smallpox, residential schools, so many other things to kind of pull us away from, well, the smallpox, it tore our population down so much. So there was that, and then to be hit with the residential schools, and just the shift in our culture from speaking Haida to English. Like there were so many things pushing the reserves being introduced. So that I kind of knew of that, but I didn't know that meant our art was being under our art, and the songs and dances were being under that same umbrella of being pushed away or just not happening, that it could have been gone. So that idea that he was at one point when he was young, like 14, being called, this boy could be the last. And I was like, I got to find where that was said. And he said, well, there was this older NFB film called Haida Carver. And so we dug that up. And that's where the narrator said those lines. And I was like, it just seems so important, because that's how we were being looked at. We were being looked at as a dying culture that could be gone from this earth, assimilated into what is Canada today. So I wanted to include that to me was more of that from the source. I didn't want a new narrator to just say those lines. I wanted the original narrator to have that said those words to be said in the film. So, yeah.
Okay, so Barbara, I'd like to switch back to you. You're now a community elder and an educator, and you're amazing in the sense that here you are, you appear in the current film, Now Is the Time, and you're responsible for the original film, This Was the Time, which was made in 1969. What is your sense of art in the community then and now?
Well,
Given that,
when I look back, I was in my 20s, and young people in Skidegate were learning to carve from the old masters. And, there was Tim Pearson, Charlie Gladstone, Luke Collinson, Ed Collinson, Henry Young, all these old men, and a few women. Women were learning to carve. And so for me, it was just part of life. I remember the poles that were standing along the edge of the beach when I was a little girl. And so I knew that poles had once stood. And by the time Chris comes along, it's a whole new, if you want, generation of large poles because of what has happened in Masset. And so we know that carving for jewelry, for small poles, are still happening. The laws in 51 changed so that we could go back to doing potlatches, which is the final phase of legalizing your actions. And it's part of our old laws. So all this stuff that is now happening again out in the open, because the rest of it was still happening behind closed doors, behind blankets on the windows and things like that, because the laws were such that we were forbade to do that. And so to know that our people found ways around the laws to make those things be carried forward to the next generations. For me today, looking back and seeing where we are today with a resurgence of the language, because the language is the pivotal or the kingpin, if you want, when you're thinking about a way of people live. The language carries several layers of information. It's not just the words that are spoken, but it's the knowing behind it that's important. And so when we look at carvings, when we look at the stories that the carvings represent, it takes that string that's here today in the present, and it goes back way back to floods. It goes back to the first poles. It goes back to place names. It goes back to movement of people back and forth because of climate change and all those things. So it anchors us. It anchors us here on Haida Gwaii, where our ancestors came out of the ocean. and all this knowing that's intrinsic and very much anchored in our DNA. You know, we dream and we say, oh yeah, you know, I had this dream, and we have intuition and we have all these things, but they're actually parts of us that our ancestors left with us. You know, I believe that the knowledge we have, whether it's the stories or the fact that the water was lower, those are things that our ancestors left for us, with us, about us, in the stories, in the language, in the carvings, and in the weaving, in the songs. Everything that makes us who we are is all interwoven, and we're born with it. You know, we just have to bring it out and show it to the world. We're born with it. You know, it's very much who we are.
Thank you. So Chris, I think what I noticed is when we were doing the screenings to the students, you actually had almost a vision from the time you were making the film. You said that I want this film to appeal to the youth. And you said you're going to have some animation in it and some other things in it, so that it's not a story that deals with the older generation, but the current generation and generations yet to come. One of the things that struck me, there was a screening that we went to, and this little girl asked the question, Chris, how did you get the picture to talk? And it's so naive. I think you were right when you're saying you're going to have animation in the film. Could you talk about the vision you had for the film, in the sense that even though you're dealing with the history of a people of a certain time, you also wanted to make it relevant to the younger people?
Yeah, well, that definitely went back to the whole idea for me of not knowing this story growing up on Haida Gwaii, and I didn't want our youth to go by, like to grow up not knowing the story. I didn't want to make a film that was so focused on the details, and that it went over their head, that it wasn't like a teacher or an adult trying to speak to them and go, you know, like, pay attention, don't, you know, hey, your head's down, you know, you got to pay attention. I wanted to draw them in, and I did that because Robert, when I was talking to him, he would tell me about the magic of the day, the magic of the pole. And for me, there's this ignition of fireworks went off in my head that made me think of animation, because there's this magical quality to animation, this idea of bringing something to life. And I feel the same way with our artwork. It feels alive, and the idea with the carvings, like the carver, and in this situation being Robert, carving in his studio, and everything else that he's created is coming to life, and interested in what he's creating now. What is he bringing to life and bringing into our realm of the living? Because our stories are in these poles. They're living stories. They're alive. So I wanted to draw the youth in, and the way I did that was through animation, and it also fit, I think, perfectly with the film and the story. Yeah, so I loved that it seemed to have worked with our youthful community and on Haida Gwaii, and yeah, they seem to be engaged. And I do remember also asking, I don't know why I asked this question, but I asked if they could guess how old I was, and one of them put their hand up and said I was like 90. Are you 98? Well, not quite that old yet.
Yeah. So Barbara, you're now an educator and a community elder, and can you give us a sense of what that entails? And does this film fit in anything that you have to do? However you want to address that.
The film fits into absolutely everything I do. I am blessed to be able to to not so much go into the high schools, but I go into our little kids' school occasionally. But I teach teachers. I teach or work as a bridge between scientists and our traditional knowledge holders up and down the coast. And so when I look at this film, and hopefully many of the grad students that I spend time with are part of the audience today, it explains to them a different depth of knowledge in how we hold it up and how we move it forward and how things evolve from being on the land for thousands and thousands of years. And, you know, the knowledge that comes forward from knowledge holders or hereditary leaders is really important. When we look at climate change in particular, if we look at the laws of governance and food security, and when you look at respect and responsibility in laws, and you look at how, in this case, Robert's Chinai, Robert, is telling Robert what he has to do. And that didn't come out of nowhere. I mean, that came from his experience when he was a young man and watched probably a pole being put up. And so all those traditional knowledge things and the knowing that comes from being in one place is the type of knowledge that as a teacher, I want the young people to know about that we were not here as not humans. You know, if you look at the Indian Act, if you look at fisheries, those laws that were brought from away and put on these lands have caused so many issues when it comes to looking at territories, responsibilities, respect, reciprocity, all those things, you know, that are so important, that were the underpinnings for our culture. I want people to know about that, because those are the things that made it possible for our ancestors to be on these lands after thousands and thousands and thousands of years of occupying these islands. So it fits very well in the knowledge realm of trying to show others the value of old knowledge.
And Chris, I think I'll give you the last word. We're pretty close to the end of our time here. But I want to go back to that screening in Masset. And the film is 16 minutes long, and I remember the Q&A lasted about 2.5 hours. And what I came away from that is that it was such a cathartic event that people just went up and they expressed themselves, and nobody was called off the stage or anything like that. It was just a beautiful moment. Chris, what's your last word on how that moment remains with you, or what do you think it means or represents?
Yeah, well, I think about what Barbara was saying, that you know, like if we ask for the knowledge, or we ask a question, and so the question just magically, it almost seems like it gets answered. Is that right, Barbara? Like it comes to us through our ancestors. And that night there was this moment that was quite like that. It was the Christian got up and
Candace,
thank you. They started singing the song, the Haida song, and everybody started singing, like everybody in the room started singing, including myself. And I didn't know I knew that song. And I sang every word of it with them. And later on, like it just came out naturally. And later on, I was thinking, how on earth did I know all the words? I don't know. It was pretty incredible. So that was one of the real special moments where they just, again, that wasn't planned. It felt right. So they did it. And yeah, it really added to that beautiful night. And I thank everybody from Masset and the whole community of Haida Gwaii for coming out and experiencing that and being there with us. And yeah, hawa to everybody.
And I would like to thank you and Barbara for making the time to participate in this discussion. Very, very informative and very, very inspiring. Thank you, both of you.
Thank you, Selma.
Thank you, Selwyn.
Thank you, Barbara.
Thank you, Chris. I'm so proud of you.
Thank you. Love you.
Love you too.